Thank you, Marshal. Retired chiefs, distinguished veterans, DG CAPS. I'd like to thank CAPS for giving me this opportunity to speak on the subject of IF as a tool of comprehensive national power. I will say it's somewhat that my thunder has already been stolen by the CDS. I think it pretty much summed up the Air Force's role in the comprehensive national power, but I will, so therefore I can cut out a few things, and GS will be happy with my time management. So just like human beings, nation states also aspire for status and power that could be wielded as and when required to achieve desired outcomes. History is replete with examples of great rise and fall of empires and nation states, and therefore the emergence of new technologies, connected businesses, and reliance on global trade with faster and easier connectivity across the world have only exacerbated the challenges for the leaders of the world in estimating this rise and fall. The tools of power are undergoing a change with technological developments that can be witnessed by the role and influence that information warfare wields over the ongoing conflicts, including the prolonged Russia-Ukraine war that is completing a year with no end in sight. The world order that seems to be emerging out of the Ukrainian rubble looks an awful lot like that of the Cold War, where a democratic and capitalistic first world would be facing off against an autocratic second world, in other words, read China, and the third world, that is all of us, looking on and trying to figure out which side we should be stepping on. So let us examine some of these aspects, how these changes affect comprehensive national power. So I'll cover my presentation under the following heads. We'll look at some of the elements of comprehensive national power, and I promise not to be, this is not a lecture on CNP, but the IF's role in it, so I'll try and be short. The role of military in comprehensive national power, and then the contribution of IF in this, and what are the strategies we need to adopt to enhance our comprehensive national power, and how that relates to the Indian Air Force. So comprehensive national power is a concept that is based on contemporary political thought of the People's Republic of China. China is at a strange juxtaposition. Its CNP is primarily a Chinese concept today. China is our principal adversary, and China is also intersects the polarity of power, the changes that are taking place in CNP and the poles that are emerging. China is also at the center of that. So I'll be referring to China quite often during my presentation. And to start with, these are the two, so-called definitions or trying to describe what comprehensive national power is. Basically, to capability of the country to pursue its strategic objectives by taking necessary actions internationally, and the degree of ability to mobilize and utilize strategic resources of a country to realize national objectives. Now, so therefore, it's two things. It's how you jostle amongst all the powers and how you utilize your resources. Why CNP? It's it's been used by policymakers and strategists to understand the relative power of nations. Basically, CNP can be quantified in a single numerical value, and its change over a period of time can be used as to how you are progressing by increasing your CNP relative to another nation or lack thereof. So, since it can be quantified to some extent, relative changes allow for correction of policies and to make informed decisions about national security, foreign policy, economic development, and competitiveness. Inability to monitor this change and adapt the power structure and its attendant instruments of power to evolving concepts and requirements can lead to serious degradation with disastrous consequences for the nation. Successful measurement can better explain concepts such as polarity, balance of power, and transition. If you look now at the elements of CNP, I think the CDS explained in great detail the right side, which is the which are the 7 points that Chanakya brought out. But on the left are summarized what are the elements of CNP. And when we talk about capital resources, it is not only financial capital, it's also human capital. That is very important. And it's also the fact that how these elements can be orchestrated in order to influence others. CNP, the first quantification of CNP was attempted by Ray Klein in 1994. He was a CIA analyst who created this paper. This was his formula: critical mass plus economic strength and military strength multiplied by strategic purpose and national will. So, strategic purpose and national will are very, very intangible factors. And when the Chinese looked at this quantification, they never looked, they discarded all the intangible factors. And they stuck to models that were more or less, quantifiable. For example, you could have indices of and elements of sub-elements. For example, if you had economic resources, could be extrapolated from GDP, whether it was actual or PPP, or if human capital was there, it could be extrapolated from, indices could be extrapolated from literacy rates, number of postgraduates, quantity of research papers, etc., etc. So, having said that, it is universally recognized that there is no one single model that quantifies the CNP of a particular nation. There are many models, and many of the think tanks, etc., use different models which sometimes are biased and enhance their own CNP rather than be more objective. So, many of these indices have been, published. There is one index which is the NCPI, National Comprehensive Power Index by the Belfer Center of Science and International Affairs at Harvard. It measures comprehensive national power based on 6 components: economic capability, military capability, technological innovation, human capital, demographic advantage, and energy security. And as per that, United States, of course, is number 1, China is number 2. By most indices, they are. Number 3 is Russia. It remains to be seen whether the next one after the Ukrainian war will still put them in that place. 4 is Japan, 5 is India, followed by Germany, United Kingdom, France, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. This DIME model was also spoken about by the CDS, and it comprises, these are the instruments of comprehensive national power, and basically the features through which national comprehensive power is exercised. So the role of the military is pretty self-evident in comprehensive national power, because it is the hard power. But if you look at one of the scholars, they said it needs to be borne in mind that growing economies have always needed military prowess to sustain and grow. For example, in the ancient and medieval ages, the political and economic interests of Rome were promoted and secured by land-based power projection. Later, British promoted and secured their interests with sea power, and in more recent times, the US promotes and secures its global interests by synergistic application of air and space power. The lessons of history are amply clear that as and when economic strength grows, conflicts of interest arise, and military force would be essential to ensure continual growth and development. So, while economic power may be perceived to be at the heart of national power, no nation can protect itself without military power, and this realization continues to reiterate itself as many European nations and a pacifist country like Japan witness a significant increase in their defense budgets. Alliances and pacts have their limitations, and any nation aspiring to wield power and influence can only ignore its military capability at its own peril. An analysis of past conflicts proves that militarily stronger opponents do not necessarily emerge victorious, and this is being shown in the Ukraine conflict, and there are various intangibles as well that comprise components of national power. When the Chinese look at national power, this is their take on it. It says victory without war, which is what we keep quoting Sun Tzu, does not mean that there is no war at all. The wars one must fight are political wars, economic wars, science and technology wars, diplomatic wars. To sum up in a word, it's a war of comprehensive national power. Although military power is an important factor, in peacetime it usually acts as a backup force and plays the role of an invisible might. So, if we now see the role of military and the way it is evolving, one of the ways of every military would think about was to try and win limited wars. And there was an emphasis on limited, short wars, fast strategic effects that paralyze the enemy. But if you look at the recent conflict, these have, are being tested somewhat. So whether there will be a short war or a limited war will depend on the aims and objectives and how military power has been applied and whether the objectives have been achieved. So if you have, for example, an industrial capacity to sustain a long war, you will sustain a long war. Russia, with its artillery-first doctrine, is aiming to produce, as Marshal Chopra tweeted a few days back, 300 million artillery shells this year and 5 million next year. So they are going to continue firing their artillery at Ukraine, and there's going to be no short or limited war. Now, if we look at how is affected by CNP and its understanding, there is a close relationship. The country's strategy will be shaped by its understanding of its own CNP and the comparative CNP of the other countries. And a country with strong military power but weak economic power may choose to focus on military diplomacy, or a country with strong economic power but weak military power may focus on economic diplomacy. So similarly, depending on the strengths of the country, there could be soft power or hard power applications. And when we look at what are the aspirations of the country, there would be countries which would aspire to be great nations, and there are countries which would aspire to be great powers. And China is an example of somebody who wants to be a great power rather than a great nation. Ultimately, the strategy would be designed to maximize its CNP, whether that means increasing economic, military, or cultural power. So, having understood that, let us look at how IAF will influence CNP. When it exercises hard power, it exercises the vertical dimension, and much has been spoken on how the vertical dimension affects the combat, as well as its ability to bring concentration of force, have parallel warfare. Examples are many and were given in the morning, so I'll not try and repeat them. Strategic effect that is possible, not always. So this is something that we need to look at, that we cannot guarantee strategic effects, even though we may attempt strategic effects. Joint warfare is a must, and a strong air force will always ensure that deterrence is possible. In today's warfare with the Ukrainian conflict, it has become extremely clear that all these hard powers cannot be orchestrated without ISR. And aerospace, therefore, is a dimension that will contribute immensely because of its vertical dimension to getting the requisite ISR in order to be able to apply itself. And it's therefore very essential that somehow we focus on this issue of ISR and get an intelligence backbone that brings the ISR as required to the lowest level that is needed. The depth and breadth of air power is quite obvious in the sense that whether it does offensive or defensive operations, and here I have reiterated C4ISR once again. This constitutes the lessons that have been learned from the past, from our conflict during the earlier years, whether it was 1965, where the Indo-Pak conflict witnessed the first full-scale employment of air power, and which was still in the process of consolidating itself, and the way it was applied in 1971, the entire width of the breadth of air operations ensured that our armed forces didn't face any difficulties, and when they did, like in Longewala, we made those significant close air support strikes that influenced the outcome of the war. When India was taken by surprise at the scale of Pakistani intrusion in Dras and Kargil in the summer of 1999, the entry of the IAF immediately altered the nature of the conflict. Adapting to the situation, the IAF carried out a number of innovations for high-altitude warfare and carrying out air attacks with limitations of not crossing the line of control, paving the way for a hasty retreat of the intruders. While the breadth of operations are encapsulated in the first 4 bullets, we must also emphasize that the vertical dimension extends to near space and space regions. This has become a region of interest in the recent past with high altitude UAVs, and the recent shooting down of the balloon has brought into focus that this is an area of space that has become extremely important and something that is being utilized by China. They tried to, if you look at the space treaty, there is no required, no definition of space. So when we talk about space and near space, there is a little bit of an issue here. But I think this, the treaty is very clear that for space, it has to be a spacecraft, an orbital platform. And therefore, anything under that becomes sovereign airspace and is to be treated like such by all the member states. So therefore, using this airspace is now become something that is much more relevant with the kind of machines, the high altitude UAVs and lighter than air near space vehicles, and of course space operations where satellite constellations dominate. The depth of air operations, of course, is through the last 2 bullets, through the informationized warfare and the intelligenceized warfare. So warfare is a coined term by the Chinese for basically networked operations, networked warfare. But intelligenceized warfare is now something that has been coined by an analyst called Elsa Kania, who looks at artificial intelligence, big data and cloud computing, which enhances C4ISR capabilities as well as prediction models for operations. So with this huge width and depth, it contributes immensely to comprehensive national power, and of course the soft power, which with the intangible power that we've been talking about, and it is always a potent symbol of national power and pride. And humanitarian assistance and disaster relief has been spoken about amply by Tejbir. International cooperation in terms of exercises, training, etc., contributes immensely to the soft power of the Indian Air Force. Yeah, okay, another 2 minutes. So technology has allowed the Indian Air Force to become more capable, versatile and effective, while also increasing the complexity of air operations. And the integration of advanced technology is critical to the air power's ability to achieve military objectives with minimal risk to personnel and equipment. The adoption of network-centric warfare through IACCS and SDR allows to share real-time information across multiple platforms and domains, and it allows for more coordinated and effective air operations with aircraft working together to achieve mission objectives. I think some of these aspects have already been covered, so I'll skip over that. And I will come to the investment that is needed now in terms of the IAF. So while the IAF has, we look at the contribution and the role, and it's given a good account of itself in the recent operations, as well as the Balakot strike. However, to handle a situation across the LAC, a greater debate is required on the optimal ways of leveraging Indian air power should the situation escalate beyond face-offs. The PLAF has moved to counter the IAF by putting in place a dense, multi-layered and lethal air defense network of radars and latest SAMs, and also has increased the deployment of fourth-generation aircraft to airfields in the TAR. While it has concentrated on building its proven strength of ground-based air defense networks, it's also rapidly building more airfields in TAR, and our measures are also being taken to build hardened aircraft shelters. If we look at numbers, what we can employ in TAR and what they can employ against us are reasonably comparable according to certain studies. However, what is happening is that as per a study a couple of years ago, the PLAF had 736 strong fourth generation platforms in its inventory. Of course, not all in TAR, but total overall. And this is increasing at the rate of 70 aircraft per year. So at the present moment, they are estimated to have around 850 of such platforms, or roughly 40 squadrons. So therefore, the numbers is something that we have to look at. And the situation will get worse as the J-20 production ramps up. And even if all our plans fructify the way they are supposed to, including the MRFA, we may not have more than 35 squadrons by 2030. So we stand at a critical crossroads with the PLAF, and therefore numbers is something that we need to look at. The same situation applies to force multipliers, ISR assets, stealth UAVs and UCAVs, and anti-UAV systems. I think we are all very familiar and know what are the gaps in these numbers, and the biggest gap that I have been continuously highlighting is that the ISR gap. Now, when we look at strategies to enhance CNP, we find that these are the factors that will enhance comprehensive national power, that is the economic development, diplomacy, military strength, cultural influence, science and technology, and human capital. And if we invest in the Air Force, these are the factors that we touch upon. So that we increase our military strength, our science and technology base goes up, international resources, that is diplomacy, goes up, economic resources go up, and human capital goes up. So if we invest in the Air Force, we are having a multiplier effect on our CNP. And therefore, to conclude, I could say that if you look at these influences and the manner in which it affects the country, air power as an adjunct of military power is an important and inalienable component of national power that has been successfully used by the nation through all domains to protect national interests and empower the nation. The IF has always risen to the occasion and carried out the tasks that were assigned to it. The Ukraine conflict has underscored the importance of developing comprehensive national power, which requires a multifaceted approach. We must also be prepared to adapt to new forms of conflict and engage in partnerships and alliances to counteract potential threats. As long as Pakistan was our principal adversary, our CNP increased at its commensurate rate, but we increasingly confront a rising China whose modernization is moving on, copying Western designs and concepts and leapfrogging to become a technology leader. And it has systematically built up its military. Taking a leaf from US thinking, it has realized early that the aerospace domain is critical. So in our quest to compete with China, at least along the LAC, we need to up our game as well. While the government is doing its utmost to raise economic power at the fastest pace, An investment in the Indian Air Force can significantly contribute to India's endeavor to enhance its CNP by having a multiplier effect to its defense and security capabilities, technological advancements, human and financial capital, as well as strengthening its strategic relationships. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, sir. When I had left home today morning thinking I'm chairing session, I thought at least I'll get to speak here. But luck follows, I guess. Thank you, sir. That was very illuminating talk. Now, coming to space domain, when I came across this book by John Gray, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, I thought he was just using the metaphor to convey that they're from different planets, and he chose Venus for women because it was named after the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Little did I know that on Venus, sun rises from the west and sets in the east, and on Venus, a day is longer than its year. Anyway, that's on the lighter side. Mankind has been exploring space since long, but we are yet not particularly very smart in space. If I draw an analogy and you imagine space to be combination of all the oceans put together, then I think we are sitting on the edge with our toes touching the water. India, of course, has taken great leaps. It justifiably needs to be proud of its achievement. It was the 4th country in the world and first in Asia to launch Mars mission. And its latest achievement in the SSLV liftoff on 10th February this year, placing EO7 in the LEO orbit is worth mentioning. Space is very vast and extreme and extremely complicated, difficult to comprehend. So that is why when people generally talk about space, they seem to be going round and round. But we have with us Group Captain T.H. Anand Rao, Senior Fellow at the Center of Air Power Studies, who will illuminate us better on the space. Space has already become an operational domain. World is already seeing creation of military space forces. US Space Force and UK Space Command are already in force, and Group Captain Rao will tell us more about it. He is alumnus of Defence Services Staff College, Wellington, served in operational and staff appointments. He's a keen observer of the space domain. Area of interest is its space security and policy analysis. He has written many papers and articles on the issues concerning space security. He has authored a book titled India Space Security Dilemma, which was released in 2021. His present topic of research is space domain awareness. Over to you now. Please, you're from CAP, so I think you can stick to time.